Hello everyone and welcome to week 7's recap video of the Opus Magnum tournament. As you can already tell, this is going to be slightly different because this puzzle was a cycles optimization challenge for category 1. I have changed the resolution of the game to 4K. Why would I change the resolution of the game because of a metric? Well, the game was written such that UI elements scale as a fixed number of pixels rather than a fixed percentage of the screen. So the only way to zoom in and out in the game is to change your screen resolution, and the way to zoom out on a cycles puzzle to see everything is to set your resolution to 4K, and there are going to be several solutions here which we will need the full screen to be able to see. Now the puzzle is designed to be the most difficult puzzle so far in the tournament. It has almost all of the glyphs. It does not involve triplex or quintessence, but it does have purification and projection on these LEDs in the litharge input. It requires use of the Van Berlo's wheel to get the salt, from litharge and turn it into air and water. And it has Quicksilver in this input for projection so that this litharge is faster to turn into gold. And there's a vitae here that has no purpose in any of the products, so it either requires building a waste chain or using the disposal glyph. This process is, as we talked about in week 2, pure ejection is sometimes non-trivial, but this process is fortunately straightforward if you're talking about maximizing throughput. If you take 2 of this iron, this input is equivalent in its metals to 1 iron, because you pair these to get a tin, a second tin, and pair it to get an iron. If you take 2 iron, you can make 1 copper and combine that with 2 quicksilver to get a gold. So 2 of these and 2 of these makes 1 of these, and 2 vitae waste. So if you're trying to create this maximum throughput solution, then you would be creating an output every 4 cycles using 2 of these and 2 of these, which take 4 cycles to grab 2 inputs. Maximum throughput might not be the best idea in this puzzle for getting the lowest cycle count because of the fact that it takes so long to start with 8 lead and reach a single gold with 6 bonds on it. You have to first disassemble this input, put all of the LEDs on projection onto purification glyphs, reach copper, and then project it twice using this. And the latency on that is very large. If you write down in paper the fastest you could get a single output built if you use 2 inputs only, that first output isn't going to be dropped until cycle 22 if you're doing everything as fast as could be possible. 22, and then you build an output every 4 cycles after that, makes the theoretical limit of a max throughput solution 42. Assuming, again, that you're using 2 inputs for every output. We'll see that the solutions took other approaches besides max throughput. Not in general, there are some max throughput solutions as well, but as with every other video, let's start first with at the bottom of the submissions list. So let's start with Orion's Belt 05. Orion's Belt's first submission to the tournament. Oh gosh, it's so much harder to see things. Yes, he's written his Magnum Opus, his entry to this tournament. So this puzzle doesn't fill the entire screen here at this 4K resolution. But as you can see, it takes 2 of the inputs, it turns 1 of them into air and 1 of them into water, grabs each atom individually while it goes through a chain to build into a gold, and then it assembles. Now, because it is using 2 of the metal inputs, but it is not getting it in 4 cycles, it's blocking this input for far longer, so it's able to grab more than 2 of the Quicksilver during this time. And in fact, 2 Quicksilver are used on the right half of the solution, 2 Quicksilver are used on the left half of the solution, and they still make it from iron, but this becomes silver and purifies into gold. It still takes 3 purification steps and 2 projection steps, but it doesn't hit the optimal purification threshold that we talked about for week 2, instead wasting a couple of Quicksilver versus if you had combined at the iron stage and used only 2 to get to gold. But regardless, we can step through it now to see what it is doing. The first thing it is doing is making this star shape here with the lead in the middle, which allows you to pivot every unbonding and use the same unbonder every cycle. Or I guess every second cycle, because you need to grab the piece that is just unbonded. And then it's doing all of its assembly here on this multibonder. Meanwhile, the Van Berlo's wheel comes in, it gets out of the way for 1 cycle because of the need to pass things across. It's because this track segment for arm 15 is needed. But it also it throws a little party down here in the bottom corner while nothing is on these glyphs because there's no reason not to write spin, 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 all the way along the track for arm 1. So if we were to actually analyze the solution for throughput, it's building one output per instruction tape, and this starts from cycle 0 to cycle 49, 98. So it takes 49 cycles for each instruction tape, at which point it creates one product. So to create 6 products, it would clearly take just short of 300 cycles, and that is what it does. It takes 295 cycles to complete. This is more of an elegance-inspired solution than a cycles-optimized monster. But as a Magnum Opus for joining this tournament, I'm very glad you were able to join in on the hard week and still solve it. So good job, Orion's belt. Up next on the list, we'll look at the solution from Mattermonkey. Mattermonkey has 184 cycles. Again, doesn't quite fill this 4K space, but I promise you it will be relevant when we get to the biggest monsters on this. So we see this track with 6 arms holds all of the atoms which are going to be added to this gold. And this is a feature of this puzzle as we see more and more, that there will be a lot of time where there's a lot of salts on the board, but the metal is still in flight. And what do you want to do with those salts? Will you store them in some track loop? Will you bond them all together so that you can move them around and then get them unbonded? The process of converting the metals is clearly the slower one of the two that can be performed with these atoms. The salts will run ahead and the metal will run behind. This is an example of how to handle it. There will be other solutions that handle it differently. This solution also doesn't use the glyph of purification at all. It only uses Quicksilver. It uses 5 of them per 5 per output it builds, just to go straight from a lead all the way to a gold. And it takes all the other lead and it treats it as waste, and it pushes it off to infinity. It also pushes the Vitae off to infinity. The disposal glyph here sits unused. I'm noticing also that the solution becomes rather chuggy when there are this many atoms on the board. The waste chains just grow without bound, but it doesn't keep adding to the area once the actual solution has completed. So 184 cycles, this is Mattermonkey. Next we will look at Mr. Puzzle. Mr. Puzzle tried for a simple approach as well, and you can see again 5 Quicksilver are going to be used, there's no purification, and a lot of waste is going to be formed. There are 3 projection glyphs here to allow the metal to swing by and project on alternate cycles without a lot of extra work. But the waste is swinging, and so, oh my goodness, does the solution get chuggy. It also, the salt storage is achieved by arm 2, which is a 6 arm, which grabs 1 salt at a time and rotates, and it passes them salts over a duplication glyph before reaching the bonder, which allows them a very clean in-flight conversion into air and water. This looks like a solution that is optimized for some apart from the use of extreme amounts of area. It has a good cycles to cost balance, but that doesn't mean that it has the absolute best cycle count. We move on now to Chickens in the Attic. Chickens in the Attic cycle submission is starting to take up quite a bit more space, and it's moving at a slightly better throughput. Let's see how long between the 2 grab instructions. Now, it is doing multiple outputs per tape loop here. So the first one goes from 0 until 16. So I am presuming it is going to be creating 1 output every 16 cycles in the infinite limit with a little bit of lead time. Unless this seems to be grabbing to produce something every 16 cycles. I'm just surprised that it would take, see, 16 times 6 is 96. So yeah, it's just over 100 cycles. Meanwhile, how many Quicksilver is it grabbing in this time? It is grabbing 5 Quicksilver in 16 cycles, so it is using projection only because it takes 5 Quicksilver to get all the way from lead to gold. So that's another solution which doesn't employ purification at all and instead views a lot of this lead as waste. But at least it's not swinging waste, so the computer is happy enough to simulate it while it is recording 4K. All right. And this is a very clean realization of a Quicksilver-only approach that has every 3 track loop here to grab it so that it can do, well, it could grab it in 15 cycles, but it's limited to 16 by the other choices made. But let's start to really crank up the throughput. Up next, we'll look at a solution from Brother Mojo. And now we're starting to fill the space. You can see an army of purification glyphs. So clearly the purification is going to be used. There's going to be actual lead converted into tin with purification. You won't be able to keep up the simple machines if you're trying to use fewer Quicksilvers. You need 5 Quicksilvers to be able to go straight from lead to gold without purification, and that means you can only produce an output every 10 cycles. These solutions are going to be producing an output more often than every 10 cycles. Let's watch Brother Mojo's solution start. So the initial part of this puzzle is going to be a giant disassembly pipeline that turns this into so many individual atoms that are all going to be held in separate arms. And you can already see that there are so many arms devoted to grabbing onto salt as it's being thrown into this pipeline at high throughput. It still isn't max throughput. If you watch this, it grabs 4 inputs and then waits a bit. Well, that's not even representative because there's a lag at the end of the solution. But even here, 1, 2, 3, 4, wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, wait. So you need 12 inputs to be able to produce the 6 outputs, and it's grabbing 4 of them and then pausing for 2 cycles. Grab 4 of them and then pause for 2 cycles. And the reason is because of this decision that he has at the end of his solution to use consecutive outputs to catalyze each other. Or not even catalyzing each other, actually. Is there a point? No, it's always the wheel. But it's the wheel on a back and forth on a track like this. That's actually really neat. Oh, the reason it takes 5 cycles is because the wheel has to go minus plus rotate, minus plus rotate. So it can only serve an output every 5 cycles. That's what slows it down to take 4 in 10 cycles instead of 4 in 8 cycles, which would be the maximum throughput. Meanwhile, how do we even begin to parse a solution which has this many arms doing this many? Like if you scroll down the instruction tape, you see it goes on forever. It's 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 89 arms. Now, in the 1,500 or so hours that I've played Opus Magnum, I've created my fair share of giant monsters, and this looks similar to those, so I can start to try to help explain what's going on here. Usually there will be track loops, so you have a goal number of cycles before you do the same thing again. And in a track loop like this, for example, you have 2 arms that are trying to serve a purpose every 10 cycles. Or they're going to be serving a purpose every 4 cycles, but each one gets back to where it started after 10 cycles because that's how long it takes for 2 outputs to have processed. So you watch them, one of them will grab, rotate, drop, then the other will do the grab, rotate, drop. This allows them to not have to do the cycles spent resetting because the next arm takes its place instead. And so you see these little 3-arm, or these triangle track with 2 arms on it units in quite a few places. These help do a few actions with low latency to get the things out of the way for the next piece coming through the pipeline. These pistons manage to stay out of the way. There will usually be islands of arms and then islands of there are not arms here so that the atoms can travel. And here's a really good example of an island of arms where it's always safe to place an arm somewhere as long as it can do meaningful work. You're not going to have to worry about collisions. Something that's like arm 52 here, or maybe that's 32. I honestly can't read. It looks like 32 on the TV screen. Like this arm is more in the danger zone because it's in the middle of a bunch of paths of atoms, effectively diverting them in 2 different directions. But as long as you're very careful with your paths, those sort of arms are also allowed in this sort of solution. And then once you actually start purifying metals, there are fewer atoms to deal with because 2 iron becoming 1 copper. This used to be 8 lead, and you don't have to carry 8 lead and keep them from colliding with your solution. By this point, it's a single atom of copper. The only thing that is numerous and problematic is this amount of salt. But you can see that this huge track assembly at the top is Brother Mojo's solution for storing all of the salt, because it is present here for way longer than the amount of time that it takes to get everything ready. The salt has to delay. And fortunately, because it is doing some repositioning while delaying, you can see that once the copper is grabbed here, it is project, bond to 3 things, bond to 3 more things. So that's as fast as you can get that copper to become a gold with 6 bonds on it. 2 cycles projecting, and then 2 cycles bonding in the center of a multibonder where you've filled all the other sides of the multibonder as immediately as you can. So this has a minimum latency path from copper to gold with 6 bonds on it. The problem being the output's way over here. So now all the extra time lost from this point over to here is time spent traveling. Like this whole assembly has to travel, and then it's also time spent coloring those salts in using this Van Berlo's glyph, or Van Berlo's wheel. So I'm sure that the attempt to minimize latency here was with good effort to try to keep the cycle count as close to the 42 max throughput limit as it could be. But the reality of these glyphs are extremely far apart and nothing is colored with the Van Berlo's wheel yet meant that, okay, we're going to add a dozen or so cycles. It came out to 65. So given the throughput, I think this one could have been as low as 45 if done perfectly. So there's quite a bit of extra latency here just traveling over to this glyph and putting it out on the output. But that starts to give an idea of what considerations are being taken when someone designs one of these giant max throughput solutions with stuff traveling every which way. So now let's move on. We've got a handful more of that style of solution to look at in this. Up first we have Omni. This one still is bigger than the 4K screen can allow. Imagine looking at this one if you have like a 1280 by 720 monitor. I'm very glad that I connected to the TV for this video. So this is an island of entirely debonders with one bonder here at the bottom. I'm very curious, all of them are being used. Oh, this looks like, I think Rolomni studied Greamy's litharge separation solution because this is the debonder pattern employed by that. Now all four of these atoms are held and, or no, two of them are not held. Well, it allows all the lead to go to roughly the same position. In litharge separation, the goal is, of course, for all the lead to go onto a lead output. But here, the goal is to then purify everything. So this bonder is used to bond some salt together, and eventually all 6 salt are placed on this gold, but with bonds in wacky directions. Meanwhile, the very first salt right here takes quite a long route. Now, of course, whenever you're running one of these pipelines and you have to get things around other things just to be able to get out of the way, it might not be feasible for this salt to travel downwards through the purification. It'll just take too long to get the next piece into place if the salt has to wait for the purification to happen. So instead, the salt goes around the top, bonds with a salt from a previous iteration, and the two of them, let's see which, there's a pair of salt here. I want to see where it merges with the rest of the stack. So there's copper being made. It bonds to the copper immediately. Okay. So it's still matching the salt from the first input with the metal from the first input, and it's waiting until the second input to the Ceph before it actually achieves that. At which point, these two salt, these two salt, these two salt, and this copper all belong on the same output, and it's able to get to there. It does 2 projections, and then it bonds everything together, and all that's left is coloring them with the Van Berlo's wheel. And in fact, I'm slightly confused. Oh, those 2 salts from the beginning of the solution were not from the first 2 out. So the first 2 inputs make this pair of salt and this pair of salt. There are 8 salts being grabbed here that go down and serve as catalysts. Now I really like this kind of a solution because these catalysts down here help you avoid needing there to be like, you can't place 2 Van Berlo's wheels. And you don't want to have large objects colliding next to the Van Berlo's wheel, so it either requires you take a lot of care like Brother Mojo did, or you use catalysts here. So the salts are running so far ahead that the salts from the 3rd and 4th input, like the ones going left and right, so the 3rd input to the right and the 4th input to the right provide the first output salts. The 3rd input to the left and the 4th input to the left provide the second output salts. So that is an answer that I really like to the question of, what do I do with all of these salts that are spilling out? If you're at a consistent throughput, you can just match the metals with a salt from a slightly different numbered output, and it'll still work. This still works forever. If you stop grabbing inputs, then eventually you will have no salts to pair with the next output. There will be one that doesn't get its salts. But because you're grabbing them forever, grabbing some early salt and using them in this way is entirely fine. So this solution really is close to what I had for my own approach to the problem. There's Quicksilver here at the bottom that follows a nice path to get onto the left half and to the right half of the machine, even though that's a lot of time spent handling and regrabbing. The Quicksilver doesn't have to be there early because it's, for max throughput, required that you get all the way up to iron and then all the way through to copper, actually. You need to have a copper metal made from purification only before you even start to project. And you can see the Quicksilver are here with plenty of time to spare, despite having this many grabs to get into position. Meanwhile, the Vitae is properly disposed of. So yeah, this is taking its time on the Quicksilver because it doesn't need to rush that. It's using the salts from the beginning as catalysts so that it can make some use of the fact that it's always running ahead on salt. And it's using the litharge pipeline here to debond everything as quickly as possible. The real slowdown, and the reason that this is 61 cycles and not 42, is the fact that, well, if we watch these metals, there's a lot of time between when they actually get their bonds started and when then they get their bonds finished. While they're catalyzing here, they also are correcting the bonds between gold and the outside atoms, and they're correcting they're getting rid of any bonds that are between the outside ring. And that adds a handful of cycles. I'm not entirely sure if it adds as many cycles. I mean, it has to. Yeah, this adds roughly as many cycles as it would take to explain 61, but the throughput is... Oh, wait, no, the throughput is not perfect. This is every 5. Here this whole time I've been thinking throughput was perfect. 1, 2... Okay, yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's grabbing 2 inputs every 9 cycles. So where Brother Mojo's was grabbing 2 inputs every 10, or 4. No, this is doing the exact same thing as Brother Mojo's. Here I am fumbling over my numbers again. This solution is grabbing 4 inputs every 10 cycles. Brother Mojo's solution is grabbing 4 inputs every 10 cycles. So this is solving a lot of the interesting problems of salt storage and catalysts and getting the Quicksilver into position in time, but it is not running at maximum throughput. I'm wondering if the Quicksilver is not running at max throughput either. Nope, it isn't. This looks like it had the design of a max throughput solution and even fooled me into believing it was one for a long time until I looked and I saw that the second input pivots, blocking from grabbing on cycle 5. And this grab doesn't happen until cycle 6. So this is an 80% throughput solution similar to Brother Mojo's with slightly better latency due to using catalysts, and that's why it is 4 cycles faster. But now we can move on. I mentioned max throughput is not something that everyone chose to go for. The best example so far would be that by Tweedledee. Instead of using nearly max throughput, but then trying to formulate the process as though it was max throughput, what Tweedledee has done is performed every 3 using this input. So this is not going to be grabbed every second cycle. It's going to be grabbed every 3rd cycle. But the Quicksilver is going to be grabbed every 2nd cycle. What that means is, if you create, in 6 cycles, you grab 2 of this input, you can create one copper as before. But you can also just create an iron, throw away 4 lead, and then use 3 Quicksilver. And that at least speeds you up because the purification doesn't have to go through 3 stages, it only has to go through 2. It also means that you get to use a single pipeline, because you can service this sort of large input every 3rd cycle. If you use every 2nd cycle, you need to throw it in 2 different directions, and that gets a little messier. But if we watch this solution run, it'll have iron, as we see right here. It'll project it 1, 2, 3 times, form some bonds, and then go up to this stored salt that has already been colored with air and water. Another benefit of using a single pipeline is if everything is passing through the same Van Berlo's wheel, you don't have to try to do 2 different things with the Van Berlo's wheel, whether that's catalysts or have the pipelines reconverge and be extremely careful not to crash. So this solution takes only 56 cycles, but let's try to think about, we've determined 42 is the limit if you're trying to do maximum throughput. What's the limit for this approach? So I said that the latency is 17 if you were to grab 2 inputs of each type and try to build an output. And that or 17 meaning that the fastest you could actually drop the output is cycle 22. If you're using projection 3 times instead of twice, that cuts 3 cycles away from using purification and then adds 1 to actually use the projection. That improves your first output to cycle 20. It's actually faster to consume more Quicksilver if you have it available. But then it takes 6 cycles to produce an output because you need 3 Quicksilver to keep that up. So you would not be able to use Quicksilver 3 times unless you were taking 6 cycles per output. So an additional 6 outputs would be, let's see. Oh no, it's even better than that because then it's better than that because you have all the lead you need after a single input. So you don't need to wait until grabbing the second input to be able to make the first output. So the first output in an approach like this could be as early as 18. But then it's plus 6, plus 6, plus 6 for 48. So this approach is limited at 48 cycles, but it's quite a bit easier to get started because you only have 1 pipeline past the Van Berlo's wheel, and you have only 1 use of these purification glyphs, which already can be used every 3rd cycle. And as we see Tweedledee here, using these glyphs every 3rd cycle. They move the tin off right as the lead moves on, allowing there to be no excess duplication of these purification pipelines either. The every 3 approach is very slick. It simplifies the problem a lot. And when you go in knowing that you're going to do every 3, you get to use Quicksilver more effectively. Pebbles, it's okay. Come here. So a very effective approach for 56 cycles for Tweedledee. Up next, we're going to look at a solution from Findear down to 51 cycles. Now, Findear's solution is maximum throughput. It's going to be grabbing this input every 2nd cycle, and there's only 1 use of the Van Berlo's wheel up top. So what does this bottom pipeline do? Well, as we can see before, the first thing to do is to purify to iron, and what Findear does is he bonds an iron to a stick of 3 salts. Now this looks nothing like the salts will look like in the output, but also the iron still has to do 1 more purification before it becomes gold. On the top half, the 3 salts here have been colored with air, water, air already, but the bottom half has no coloration, doesn't have a Van Berlo's wheel to use. But it does have the top half. So what Findear does is he bonds these 2 iron with 3 salts together, and it causes these to duplicate off of each other. So now there's 6 elements here, and then a purification between these 2 irons, so that the second part of the solution is just responsible for reorganizing these into the things that are going to go into this multi-bonder, and to get there before the gold is ready, or at least as quickly as possible. What this means is every 4 cycles, the middle here will converge with an iron and 3 salts, which is maximum throughput the whole way. Every 4th cycle this happens. And then this entire right half of the solution has to run on a tight 4-cycle loop using 8 input atoms and 7 output atoms. So there's a lot of handling to do, and you can see that there are a lot of arms, but only this air out the bottom has to go in a direction that would otherwise conflict with the arms. For the most part, it's still obeying the arm island, atom island, arm island paradigm. So this is a really good use of max throughput. It actually is creating an output every 4 cycles instead of, on average, it's exactly every 4 cycles. And where does the extra latency come from? If this is trying to do the same thing that would get you a 42 in theory, where is the extra 9 cycles coming from? Well, so there's a regrab on these leads that is avoidable because the leads are not spent this cycle debonding, but really, if you have the iron ready to grab on cycle 12, you're only 1 cycle behind theory at this point. The other 8 cycles come from the fact that the iron is not going into purification. It is bonding and then going along for the ride, and it doesn't go into purification until cycle 23, despite it being possible to put it on purification in general on cycle... Let's see, if you grab it on 12, you grab it on 11, which is perfect, swing on 12, drop on 13. So this seems like it's 10 cycles behind theory. I'm confused why it is 10 cycles behind theory, because it also, the gold spends 2 cycles getting its bonds. Oh, am I looking at the second? Oh, right. The lead that goes down is the limiting one. So it takes all the numbers that I was talking about were for the top pipeline, of course, but the bottom pipeline runs 2 cycles behind. So once the iron is actually dropped into the purification glyph, there's only one lost cycle in the entire thing, and that is spent waiting for the other 2 pieces to bond here on the gold. So there's one lost cycle in preparing iron, and then one lost cycle right here when this should have been bonded on all sides, but the other 2 would have collided if they moved that early. And then the other lost cycles are spent in this transit of the iron. The one from the bottom pipeline is technically limiting, so the fact that it gets here on cycle, what was it, 23 that we said, is actually 2 cycles earlier than the plus 10 that I said it was. Still, the ability to achieve maximum throughput and solve the problem of using a Van Berlo's wheel by having the salts within the pipeline duplicate each other is very smart. And this is a 51 cycle monster from Findear, and that is good enough for, let's see, what place did this get? 4th place, 5th if you count mine. Up next, we have a solution from Jin Yu. Now, Jin Yu's cycles experience with designing solutions was something I was curious to test during this tournament because Jin Yu has been remarkable in the past at creating cost and area solutions and has done really well looking at other people's designs on cycle solutions and improving upon them on their micro. Being able to see that, oh, this piston on a track can be replaced with a basic arm on a track to save cost if it just moves in this other way. But actually designing a cycle solution from the ground up is not something I had ever seen or made Jin Yu do before this tournament. And so it's going to be a bit of a struggle for me to parse what's going on here. It's not grabbing at max throughput. It seems like in the end it's grabbing 3 every 8 cycles. Dun, dun, dun. But it also grabs one input that it just throws over here to the right, and it doesn't do anything with regularly. It does it a one-time thing. And it seems to be using that to soak up some early Quicksilver that is not being used by... And so, yeah. There's a lot to look at here. One approach that is going to be worth talking about on this puzzle, because it's when I'm first seeing it, is to use the Quicksilver from the beginning of a machine in some useful way. Because if there's a lot of time, like we saw in our Omni solution with the Quicksilver coming up from the bottom, there's a lot of time that Quicksilver has that it's allowed to be doing nothing because it's not needed yet. But what if you were able to have it anyway, and could you put it to use to speed up other parts of the solution? Jin Yu saw that yes, that is possible, and is setting aside some large number of early Quicksilver, you can see on these 3 glyphs, so that this iron can promote all the way to gold, grabbed from a single odd one out input. I like to call these odd one out pipelines because they get used once over the course of the solution. It uses one input to make an iron. It needs 3 Quicksilvers to be able to complete that, but those 3 Quicksilvers are grabbed one time. Those are from the beginning of the solution before Quicksilvers are needed in their regular pipeline. Now, grabbing 3 inputs every 8 cycles, let's see what the expected limit would be. I would have 3 outputs every 16 cycles with whatever latency is happening. But there are so many different output pipelines all converging at the very last minute. Like you can see that the one that was made as an odd one out doesn't touch the Van Berlo's wheel, but it doesn't need to because, oh goodness, why is my game chugging? It's probably the 4K recording catching up to me. But there's all this extra duplication of one input off of the other here because this odd one out needed a little bit of special servicing. And all of those outputs are dropped so close to the final cycle. So there's one drop that actually happens on cycle 23, and then one on cycle 31. So it's getting an output every 8 in general. But instead of dropping this one, it uses it to duplicate. And then it cuts all this extra latency with a swing through the middle like this. There's a lot of waste in its swinging, and that is likely the reason my computer is chugging. So it's getting 3 inputs every 8 cycles, but it's not using very much of one of them. It's grabbing it for its salt, and then it even stops caring about the salt once it has gotten enough salt to finish off one of these other inputs. The salt from the odd one out is also not used. Like, this solution is, for lack of a better word, an aperiodic monster. And you can see that there are regular sections to it. Like, there are things that are repeating every 8 cycles. But I think as Jin Yu described the solution to me, he said that it was a initial idea, and instead of trying to improve the design, he found ways to improve it at a micro level until it was fast. He was able to cut from some much larger number, I think 62 cycles if this was running a max, or not even max throughput, if this was running at the original design's throughput. But he got from 62 down to 50 by odd one out to save one entire output period, and then a latency slice through the middle by using stolen lead and salt. It's a very good example of a Jin Yu creation in terms of the, well, we can save something here and we can save something here, where the actual savings in this case are cycles and not something like cost or area. But it's extremely hard to follow if you just try to watch it from start to finish, because there's this pre-initialized Quicksilver, there's all of the individually handled salts coming from all these different directions, which allow the middle pipeline to go slightly faster on the last one because of all these... yeah, that last swing right there saved a few cycles as well. Like, this is a 50 cycle solution that is worthy of third place, but darn if it isn't hard to follow. Up next, the solution that I've been excited to talk about. This is from Bambi. Bambi had not participated in the tournament prior to this, but then submits this gorgeous 48 cycle max throughput solution as his, I guess I should say, as their debut. So, similar to what we've seen in the other solutions, because it's max throughput, it's pulling the lead in 2 different directions. But these directions are nicely symmetric, and let's see how early the first iron is available. It's grabbed on cycle 13, so this officially loses 2 cycles. But what it loses in cycle count, it gains in the positioning of the salts. It doesn't have what Rolani's had of like a weird salt that has to go around the outside. All of the salts here are nicely positioned to go right past the Van Berlo's wheel. And that means that by the time the copper is actually created, there's this pretty consistently created ball with gold and water airs attached to it. And it even does 2 of the bonds here right before it gets to projection. I'm looking at the top pipeline for now, but things are not symmetrically mirrored on the bottom because they can't really be. The Van Berlo's wheel is doing something different. But so I guess Bambi had to solve the top pipeline and the bottom pipeline functionally independently, but was made sure to color these salts into water and air early on, so that while the metal was purifying, even though it's a couple of cycles behind optimal, it's ready for when the projection happens. Meanwhile, the projection requires you get this Quicksilver into these 2 projection glyphs. There is another projection glyph down here. So I suppose there's 1 in the top pipeline and 2 in the bottom pipeline, so that the bottom pipeline can achieve a little bit more motion. We'll see what the copper does. It probably has to first here, and then bond, and then here. Yeah, so each copper grabbed here makes this trip with a project, bond, and that's really nice because it very quickly gets through all of the required steps and only ends up in the end adding 6 unrequired steps to do all the handling. It's kind of a blessing and a curse when you provide a very high latency puzzle like this, that during the high latency steps you can do some movement. That means that you're not like adding tons and tons of unnecessary time by traveling across the solution, as long as, like is done here, each step is a meaningful use of a glyph. Like you watch in 4 cycles, what starts as copper, which is I believe only 2 cycles behind budget. It should be grabbed on 19 or 21. Yes, because this is the slower pipeline. So yeah, 2 cycles behind budget, and then it just grabbed, does one of the productive steps in the next direction, does another one of the productive steps, but only gets 2/3 of the way there. So this is still going to This is officially a lost cycle. And then another one of the productive steps, and then the missing one. So like, yeah, this pipeline doesn't lose much time in the process of getting around. Even though it's covering a lot of ground, which ordinarily means lost cycles, it's doing something at every step, and that something is necessary. I think this is a brilliantly organized solution, and it's incredibly fun to watch. Even it's incredibly fun to watch the giant journey that these Quicksilvers have to make around the solution in order to avoid getting in the way of the products as they're flying by. It's slightly easier to think about 2 every 8 pipelines once it's all assembled into the output, because every 8 means you have a little bit more time to move around each other. It's the beginning of this sort of a solution when everything is coming past every 4th cycle, really limits your options with avoiding collisions. But yeah, at 48 cycles, Bambi joins with 2nd place in this very difficult puzzle, so mega congratulations to Bambi. Now, I say 2nd place, there's the unranked solution from me that we're going to look at next, because I was not the winner either. I made a 45. Now, I am very proud, so I was mentioning that in an optimal solution with metal handling, you can grab onto the iron on cycle 11. My solution achieves that. Here we have a debonding pipeline that has all 4 of them. So the reason that you need 1 extra cycle when there's a swing output is because you cannot be holding on to all of these lead. But every cycle now, these lead either have to be losing one of their bonds or gaining a grab. There's no other options. If you're not losing a bond or gaining a grab, then you are losing a cycle. So this one has a grab. On this cycle, every lead loses a bond. This one already has a grab. On this cycle, these 3 all gain grabs. And in that way, when this one loses its bond, everything can go onto glyphs so that the tins are grabbed and then the iron is grabbable on cycle 11. So that's optimal lead handling. And I prioritize that one to a fault because, as you can see, similar to Omni's solution, I have a salt that is not in a good position. This salt is way over here on the left. It bonds to the salt from the 2nd time so that it can start to travel across the solution, but I had what is the slow salt pair. Now, these 2 slow salts take a while to join with the rest of the thing, but they do snap right into place. They bond onto the gold once it has all of its other salt in place, and it goes down here and it starts to do the Van Brillo process. Now, I mentioned in Rolomni's solution as well that the early salts were taken out of the pipeline to serve as a catalyst. And that allowed them to, since the salt is going to be running at a very consistent throughput, but there's early salt that's available before any of the metal is available, you just steal from the earliest part of the salt pipeline, and that allows all the following salts to follow as though nothing had changed. Another pipeline stealing that I did is this Quicksilver is available earlier than it needs to be. So you see this tiny arm on a track here, it's going to grab 1 Quicksilver and hold it out of the way. The very first time I make iron, even though at maximum throughput, the correct choice would be to put it in this purification glyph and wait for a 2nd iron to make it into copper. I just go ahead and steal that iron and put it on projection. So it takes 3 Quicksilvers instead of 2, and then 4 cycles later, the next iron comes, and it's the first iron to start waiting for a copper instead of a 2nd. That means that I've effectively stolen 2 Quicksilver from the beginning of this machine to allow it to run 4 cycles ahead on the metal pipeline. And that saves 4 cycles, real cycles in this solution, because I'm no longer looking at quite as high of a latency for the very first output. And then everything beyond that can just use one of the, like the Quicksilver is still there. It's even following the exact same path to the exact same projection glyph. It just takes slightly a different amount of time to get ready. So in a pretty lengthy document, I described this as an n equals 14 solution. What that means is that it'll grab 14 of these inputs. And the reason it needs 14 is because the salts that contribute to the 5th and 6th output come from the 13th and 14th inputs instead of the 11th and 12th. It also requires 14 Quicksilvers because the first 2 outputs each take 3, but then all the subsequent ones take 2. And so when you're making 6 outputs, 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 is 14. So it's grabbing 14 of each input and it's creating 6 outputs, which means that there's some waste left over at the end. And those 4 catalysts that live in these 4 positions of the solution to start to speed up the process of turning these salts into water and air. And then the metals from the last pipeline, when, as I mentioned before, like these the iron are going to become copper that comes down later in the pipeline. So there's an iron and then 3 copper. We're only using the iron and the first 2 copper. This copper is useless. So that copper and then all these catalysts get bonded together so that my solution can keep running in the same way that it had before. And it will crash after it's run through its tape twice because I don't actually turn this into a waste chain. I just turn it into get out of the way waste. But that's all that the solution needed so that it would record a GIF. In terms of actually interacting with the Van Berlo's wheel, this does break the conventional wisdom of having arm islands because I have to throw atoms through here once. But fortunately, a lot of the track loops aren't active yet, so I can have arms sitting in a position that keeps them out of the way. And then, because the catalysts only come into contact with the Berlo wheel once, I can get the track loops started afterwards and make sure that there's never any concern with collisions. So the arm island here is only broken by atoms once. The arm island here is only broken by atom once. And the process here for depositing these outputs, here we can see these last 2 outputs getting created. This one is able to skip 1 latency step in a way that is too complicated to describe in this video. I will link the document I wrote that's extremely long about this puzzle, but in a way that allows this rotation onto output to happen immediately and get 45 cycles. And I was extremely proud of 45. I was stuck on 46 for a little while. I stayed up until 4 a.m. one night for the worst of my health, and I finally was able to fix that extra latency by causing some disgusting choices up in this top pipeline. But I thought this would be a winning solution. And yeah, the name that we haven't said yet in this video, Penta Pig, he was able to find 43. And I've mentioned max throughput limits at 42. Mine was able to run 4 cycles ahead of max throughput, which means maybe I could have bottomed out at 38 if not for those extra cycles spent coloring the salts. But no, Penta Pig was able to pick an entirely different approach from any that we'd seen in the others. It, I guess, kind of resembles Jin Yu's in the sense that there's work being done for these early Quicksilver, but it's very well organized work. Instead of setting aside 2 or 3 Quicksilver from the beginning of this machine's execution, you can set aside 6 Quicksilver. By doing everything in this way, you can use 12 of the metal and salt input and 18 Quicksilver in total to cause you to never have to purify an iron. Every time that you come with iron, which is from 1 input, you can just pass it over 3 projection glyphs, because that 1 extra Quicksilver you held aside per output, the 6 in total, allow you to make 6 outputs without ever waiting. So we can watch this buffer in action. At this point, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Quicksilvers being held in the solution that are not even close to available yet. And then the next Quicksilvers that are grabbed are going to actually contribute meaningfully. And it can't keep this up forever, because eventually if you were to keep pulling this at maximum throughput, you wouldn't have any buffer Quicksilvers to consume. But it only needs to make 6 outputs at this speed, so it's able to emulate an every 4 solution that caps out way much, like it caps out lower. I think it caps out at 40 if you were to do it this way. And he only loses 3 cycles of latency entirely, because the handling in this metal pipeline, while it isn't perfect, it's designed around getting these salts into position so that they can do this 2-cycle bonding, as we saw in some of the other solutions like Tweedledee's and Brother Mojo's. Actually, I might be misremembering when I said Tweedledee's. Only one I'm remembering at this point now is Brother Mojo, who had the gold snapped into the middle of a multi-bonder, and then in 2 consecutive cycles, it's 3 bonds to one of the type of atom, 3 bonds to the other type of atom output. Only Brother Mojo's couldn't output because this were all salt. But in Penta Pig's case, the time that is spent getting these salts around the wheel perfectly matches with the time that is taken by these extra lead movements, and then all the time that is needed for these Quicksilver buffers to get consumed. And that allows it to produce 12 output, or to produce 6 outputs using 12 of this input, 18 of this input, all in the first 43 cycles of execution. So this is an incredible solution. And for the purpose of optimizing the cost secondary, he decided to replace a waste chain with a waste 6-arm, which of course, since you're only grabbing this input 12 times and only discarding half of their leads, then you can just throw the leads into this waste circle. That does mean that it will not GIF He actually shared a GIF in the Reddit thread which has a looping version of this that costs an extra 10 cycles because instead of an arm here, it's just, I think, a track, and then there's a bonder here. But yes, this is the winning solution for the cycles metric on this puzzle high gloss finish. And this kind of blew my mind. Seeing all these approaches, though, and seeing how low it can go, like, you might have drawn out a theory plan and had the theory plan completely shattered when you realize some feature of the approach where, given that there's so much extra time on the Quicksilver, you can speed it up in this way, or as Penta Pig found, in this way. And meanwhile, working with the Van Berlo's wheel and anything that is this busy can be a nightmare because this is a giant clunky 7-atom-sized piece that'll collide with anything you throw at it. The fact that this solution could be created within 10 days of releasing this puzzle just shows how dominant Penta Pig is in this tournament, and at this point, I think after week 7, there is no way that Penta Pig loses to anyone in this tournament. His lead is more than 10 points, and if he solves the 8th puzzle, it's all he needs to win. So, big congratulations to Penta Pig for this winning solution for Category 1. Before I forget, we also have a late entrant. We have a solution from Above that did not make it into the final output, the final spreadsheets, because it wasn't given until after the deadline. But they assured me that they had finished the solution before, so I might as well include it in the video. We can see that it's symmetrically using 2 different inputs here, but it takes quite a long instruction tape to get through them both. It does exactly what the algorithm would suggest for maximum throughput. It purifies it all the way up to copper and then does only 2 projections to reach gold. Then it does a nice little wiggle with the Van Berlo's wheel once it has bonded all of these. What's interesting to me is that it chooses to use only 2 Quicksilver and not use the disposal glyph for any metal. And this is the most efficient way to ensure that you always, if this were to be sped up arbitrarily, then yes, 2 inputs of each is the only thing you can get at 4 cycles. You wouldn't be able to use more Quicksilver, but it was interesting to compare against some of the solutions we've seen or will see in the future, which use more Quicksilver and allow themselves a little bit of lead waste, either through the disposal or through a waste chain out in infinity, to speed up the process. So this solution takes 472 cycles. Its sum score is a little over 1,000. It wasn't going to be a winner in either of the 2 categories. It's still worth looking at because I want to make sure all the effort people put into these tournament puzzles gets noticed. So this, I guess, can serve as a good bridge between the cycles and the sum because it would be the first solution we look at on sum, but it does resemble some of the sum solutions. So thank you from Above for this submission, and I'm sorry that the timing worked out such that you didn't actually get to be included for points. But here you are in the video. This is a really pretty dance on this. It's nice that water and air are at least next to each other, and it wasn't so rude as to use something like earth and air. But it's a high gloss finish, you know. It's got some nice sheen, it's got some water, it's got some sparkly gold, and it's a bridge against the air. I would like to call this the correct assignment of a high gloss finish in terms of which pair of elements I wanted to use. Now, category 2 in this puzzle was an experiment. I kind of created a shoot the moon metric, where you can try to do something extraordinarily difficult, but if you fail, you are better off optimizing something else. The challenge was, and I'll create a new solution to look at it. If you can solve this puzzle using only 50 gold's worth of mechanisms, so that's only things in this tray. Glyphs, I didn't count towards this total. If you could solve it using only 50 gold of mechanisms, then you got the best possible score effectively. But if you were not able to solve it using this extremely restricted cost solution, then you were best off optimizing for sum, which is the sum of the cost, cycles, and area of your solution. Now, what does 50 golden mechanisms get you? Well, you absolutely need the Van Berlo's wheel to be able to solve this puzzle because you have salt only in the input and the output requires colored elements, water and air. So that's 30 gold. And then the only other thing that is in here that is worth 20 gold, I mean, track doesn't buy you anything under the Van Berlo's wheel, so it's quite clear that what I'm asking for in this 50 golden mechanism solution is to somehow create a solution that uses only a single arm and no tracks. Now, I mentioned that you would want to throw things into a disposal glyph. Well, that might mean your arm has to be longer, but it doesn't really work because even then, this arm can only touch 5 other spots. One of them has to be on the output, one of them has to be on this input, one of them has to be on this input. You only have one access point. Spending it on this disposal glyph was a bad decision. Instead, as it turns out, the only way that you can prove this puzzle possible, to my knowledge, you get 3 access points that are not on an input or an output. One of them needs to be a drop-off into projection, because you need to be holding a Quicksilver that doesn't have any other things bonded to it. Purification is straight out. You cannot touch all 3 sides of this with that small of an arm, so you're going to have to treat every single lead that is not the one that goes into gold, you're going to have to treat it as waste. You already had to treat the Vitae as waste, so there's not that much news there, but it still means that this is going to be a waste juggling solution, and juggling waste when you only have one arm is not a straightforward thing. You're going to need debonding, because to be able to get a Quicksilver that you can then drop into this projection glyph, you need to be able to grab it on debonding. You can't ever work with only bonded structures if you have a Quicksilver that you need to drop off. So that leaves one access point left to make a decision. And do you want it to be on this other end of the debonder? Do you want it to be on the other end of this guy? Do you want to have a bonder? That sounds like a necessary component, but in principle, there's no reason that all the bonders can't just be far away from the arm. And I said glyphs are free, so you can place several bonders if they suit you. And you do need the duplication glyph, which is going to be over here under the Van Berlo as well. So you're going to have to create some sort of structure to even color Assault. This was an engineering challenge based on heavy restrictions of you only get one arm. It gets to do all these instructions, but it can't move anywhere else. That was the challenge. I figured that since dubious cost has been discussed often as like a high-tier Opus Magnum play, like can you create something which is the minimum cost when minimum cost seems hard, that I needed to include this in the tournament, and what better week to throw it into than the week that is already purportedly very hard. But if that fell through and you couldn't make a dubious cost solution, then you're going to create a sum-optimized solution, which is the same metric as we saw in week 1 when it was a very nice balance between cost cycles and area. You just add them all up, and what comes out looking pretty is oftentimes the best solution as well. Well, we're going to start with some sum solutions, because clearly if the winning solutions are all the dubious cost ones, and we're working our way backwards, we start with the sum. So sum optimization, as always, is a balance between the 3 pieces. I would say that this was a solution, this one from Brother Mojo, was a little bit too cost heavy. It takes 615 gold, and it is able to complete an output. Well, it's not doing once per tape loop, it's running the entire tape loop, so that's not necessarily representative, but it's able to complete in 171 cycles, which the conventional wisdom of your cost and your cycles should be within a factor of 2 of each other. This one's definitely really expensive for what it is doing. It's also using a giant spinning 6-arm, which when you look at the area footprint takes up so many extra tiles. It is using multiple grabbers of the 6-arm, which is generally a good feature, because if you're using it, you might as well use something more than what a single arm with a single grabber could use. It then passes this one onwards to help purify all this metal. Let's see what approach it takes, though. It's getting the salt. It turns the salt into this storage buffer, which, again, as we described in the cycles solutions, there is a need for there to be storage of the salts because this purification takes quite a while. And then it projects it 3 times and throws away the rest of the metal. It throws it away when it's iron, which is kind of funny. It runs it through the purification just so that the disposal step is one shorter. It's able to use the same disposal that it's using for the Vitae, which is nice. And then once it has the gold, it passes it over here and then does a set of pivots to bond it, which is the elegant way you would expect if you had 6 individual atoms and you wanted to use as little cost as possible to bond it all together, you would use a bonder. But then the number of arms in this solution still adds enough cost that it's prohibitively expensive. It still is a very elegant approach. It's just doing it with a lot more cost. Let's move on to Matter Monkey, who had another sum solution. So the Brother Mojo's value for sum was 951. For a little bit of context, I promised people who had the dubious cost achievement of 50 gold mechanisms, they would get a sum score of 300 to compare to these. So if you're setting the curve at 300, 951 is kind of limited because you're going to get a third of the available points, a little bit less than that. This is cycles. Matter Monkey's sum solution at 801. It's quite a bit cheaper. It's 200 gold cheaper than Brother Mojo's solution. It also doesn't place any purification glyphs. It is only using projection. Which, I mean, you might as well if you can. It's using an arm with 6 grabbers just to be able to speed up the process of getting all these Quicksilver in place. But that takes some area, and this waste takes some area. So Matter Monkey's solution runs 163 area once it's all finished because of all the waste it accumulates. This is similar to his cycle solution in the fact that it's very, very happy to make waste. As long as it's never going to collide with the other parts of the solution, there's not really incentive to not make waste as long as you don't care about area too much. Meanwhile, the salt is stored in this 6-arm assembly which passes over the Van Berlo's duplication glyph. So this sort of elegant storage, duplication, and then reassembly is a very pretty feature that I was happy to see in the sum solution. I would say that this resembles the best sort of approach, but then it has a bit of extra machinery to handle the waste and then all the area taken up by waste, and that causes it to fall a little short of the good sum numbers. So this is at 801. Next we'll look at Mr. Puzzle. Mr. Puzzle is at 750 sum. And similar to what we saw with Matter Monkey, there's a 6-arm storage that is both responsible for grabbing things off of the debonder, putting them over the duplication, and then putting them back onto the gold once all the bonds are ready to be made. So this is extremely common in some optimization. Try to have a 6-arm so that all the atoms that it moves, like you can achieve 6 times as much useful action if you're not worried about a budget whenever you get to place a 6-arm in your solution. The issue with this solution is that it's still using purification. It's throwing away half of its lead. The process of creating gold is not done in the most cost-effective or the most cycle-effective way, and which causes it to take 334 cycles, 320 cost. This is really well balanced in the cost cycles balance, but both numbers are actually quite a bit higher than they could be in principle. And so while Mr. Puzzle has provided us with a good solution, we can take off another chunk of sum, moving on to Tweedledee. So this was 750. We'll now look at 701, 701 sum. And yet still I can see a couple of things that I object to, like this giant 3-arm. As soon as it spins, the area number is going to shoot way up. However, I like the lack of purification in this solution. It has a bunch of multi-arms doing a lot of work in parallel. So the parallelism, the cost cycles balance are both very good in the solution, but it takes 197 area when all is said and done. And it's also kind of hilarious that the fail condition is when this lead, which is being treated as waste effectively, ends up blocking the input and causing a grab that should have been on an input to instead be on the waste. It's using the waste only because it's getting this Y shape with the metal in the middle, and it's projecting that all the way up. And then it still needs 3 more salts to be able to finish the solution, but it gets them from this other input that it grabs as waste. The approach is elegant. It's very nice to be able to do everything in this way, but the amount of space taken up is very painful to see in a sum solution. And so we can imagine, what if this was like 330, 170, but the area was 100 less? This would go from 701 to 601, and that's quite an improvement. And in fact, the reason I chose 300 for the number that you get if you're 50 golds of mechanisms is because when I created a sum solution, it was in the low 600s, and I thought, yeah, 600 is a good number, and I want the dubious cost achievement to get you roughly half of that. So at 701, this is mostly hurt by its area, but can people implement a similar algorithm in much less area? Well, we're going to move on to chickens in the attic, who we see no purification, so this has the potential to be a very similar algorithm, and in fact it is. Here's a Y of these metal, of the salts on the metal in the center, and then chickens in the attic will then just put that on a projection glyph. The second one that comes around is disassembled, but the disposal glyph is right here and available for it, so there doesn't have to be waste. There don't have to be 6 arms carrying things around. This is almost exactly what we asked for with Tweedledee's solution, but with over 100 area lower. Now, because we don't have as many 6 arms, or 2 arms, or 3 arms handling things at the exact same time, this is a lot more serial, where Tweedledee's was more parallel, so this actually loses out on quite a bit of cycles and ends up only 10 some points better than Tweedledee's. But it does show that this sort of algorithm can be achieved in a very compact space, and it's one to be emulating, because this approach of visualizing what portion of your input already looks like the output, and then doing as little as you can to turn the rest into the output, it removes the number of steps you need to take, and in that way it improves the it reduces the complexity of the solution, which complexity ties pretty well to the metrics. So the decision to place the 2 debonders that are most important to the solution in a way that allows them to get to this disposal glyph very quickly was a big part of the waste reduction. And that's a good thing to think about too, because if you're using the disposal glyph for metal, if you're using projection only, then you're going to need to use the disposal glyph for some metal. Being able to make sure the route to that is not painful is important. Up next, we're going to see Omni. So there was a tie between chickens in the attic at 691 sum, and Omni also at 691 sum. And the tiebreaker in this case was cycles, and Omni's just happens to be that little bit faster. So Omni is actually using purification, going all the way through to iron. And then the second time that an iron is made, like if you're using one input to make an iron and 3 salts, and then you're projecting that iron all the way up to gold, you'll have twice as much metal as you will have salt lakes for the output. So you'll have to throw something away, and I guess in Omni's solution, he's going to purify no matter what. Going to make an iron. The first time he makes an iron, it goes to the output. Oh, the second time he takes the pair of tins and he just throws them away. And that's an approach that I can identify with. I took the same approach in my decent sum solution. Meanwhile, this is a storage solution for all of these salts, and it takes up a fair bit of area, but the rest of the solution is so compact that this still stays under 100 area. And it uses 3 Quicksilver per output, but these arms have a lot of idle time. So now we're starting to get into the intricacies of sum. If you have a lot of arms, make sure that their idle time isn't too much. Otherwise, try to think about a design where you can have more arms being used more often. But all this idle time here is a slight penalty in the sense of things are not being done efficiently. And that leads to this being just like chickens in the attic solution, 691 sum. So there's a bit of a jump after this one, from 691 up to 639, and that 639 is my solution. It's going to look a lot like this, but it's a little bit more cycle efficient. This one coming in at 291. Mine is exactly 100 cycles faster at 191. So same as happened with Omni's solution, I just start throwing tin away because I want... I'm throwing all the tin onto this disposal. The reason that I have any metal to work with at all is because Arm 7 steals one. It actually steals the first tin and starts the process of slowly trying to bond it to all the rest of the metals while it achieves the projections. My storage solution for all the salts runs out of space way too early, so I need Arm 9 to save me. It goes down and it bonds everything together and helps Arm 7 with orchestrating bonds to be between the metal and the outside instead of between the outside itself. I thought this was pretty efficient. I didn't think when I was building it about the option to use the part of the input that looks like the output, throw away all the lead. And it turns out that the solutions that did that beat me. But at 639 sum, this is starting to get into the realm of what I would consider good sum for this puzzle. And I'm not saying that just because it's me. The next sum solution was by Jin Yu, who, if you recall, was the winner of the sum optimization solution in week 1. Jin Yu identifies appropriately that there's a bit of the input that looks like the output, and is running quite in parallel, so it achieves a much better cycle count than what we saw from Chickens in the Attic, or, well, Tweedledee's was... No, this is even faster than Tweedledee's, which had all those 6 arms. So, that's good. Oh, Jin Yu is also doing a little bit of working ahead, because Arm 1 is going to be providing salts only after the things have been completed, and in that way it ends up creating waste. Jin Yu is doing the exact same algorithm as Tweedledee. It's just instead of having a giant spinning 6-arm handling waste, he's pushing the waste off to infinity, taking a fair bit of area. This is 134, where we were saying under 100 was with the good ones. But it's still enough faster, and at 345, reasonably cheap, that it gets a 631 score on sum. So we've seen my solution, which is wasteless, and we've seen Jin Yu's solution, which is clever enough to use the part of the input that looks like the output. Let's go to a solution that does both of these things by Findear. This was the best sum submission for category 2. So we can see that the at least 2 of the 3 bonds that are present on the lead that is chosen to be the center gold are preserved, instead of trying to use the middle one, which would require actually spinning things over a bonder a few times. And then meanwhile, all of this lead is thrown away because being wasteless was apparently more area efficient. So this is 340, just a little bit cheaper than we saw from Jin Yu, but it takes almost 50 area fewer than Jin Yu had taken. In this iteration, the solution is 589 sum, but I believe we actually, as a community, looked at the solution, seeing that it was the winner and was making a very good use of a good idea. And we tried to do a little bit of micro sum optimizations on top of it, and we were able to get it down quite a lot. We were able to reduce the cost a lot without costing very many cycles, because you can see that we're just at the edge of the cost is within a factor of 2 of cycles heuristic. I think we were able to get it down to like 295 cost and just over 200 cycles. But the end effect was that we were able to optimize this as a community down to 555, which is another 34 some points better than this. So that shows that this idea can be taken really far. But of course, category 2 was about sum only for people who didn't get the 50 gold mechanisms approach. So at this point, we're done talking about sum solutions. And the reveal remains of how many people and who are they got the 50 gold mechanism solution. It's only one person, it's Penta Pig. So let's look at it. The winner and only achiever of the dubious cost challenge for category 2 of week 7 was Penta Pig with this solution. Now, it runs for quite a while, but it's scripted from start to finish due to the need to handle waste. So if I alt-click here, we can just let it run. But before I just let it zoom ahead, let's take a little bit of a look at what the decisions were. As I mentioned when I was pointing out the layout requirements, there is the Quicksilver end of projection available to the arm, there's the debonder available to the arm, and of course inputs and outputs. But Penta Pig decided to use that last access point was not a bonder, not the other end of either of these 2 glyphs, it was the other side of the Vitae and Quicksilver. Now this I didn't necessarily expect, but as he mentioned, it allows for a very clean motif when creating this structure to actually perform the projections. It's of course important that the input be suppressed, so by grabbing it by this end, the Vitae ends up suppressing the input, allowing this move to be safe. If the Vitae wasn't there, of course, this would come back and crash into everything. And then when it comes time to rotate it back off, it's onto this bonder, which allows this rotation to effectively progress exactly what had happened. So now there's gold, and the next challenge is to attach the other 3 salts to this. And waste is, of course, growing, so we start doing the 3-arm or the 3-way shuffle. Now there have to be at least one gap. It's similar to those board rearrangement puzzles, where if you don't have any gaps, of course, the thing cannot progress. There's no motions that you can do that are valid. But as long as you have a gap, you can start this shuffle process that you see happening right here. And if you have multiple gaps, you can actually do something more important, like rearranging the atoms, which is a part of this game, if I've been told. So yeah, for every output, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lead waste, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 necessary vitae waste because you have to use 5 Quicksilvers. And in Penta Pig's algorithm, there's an additional 2 uses of this vitae Quicksilver input, which mostly just help create the appropriate structure. So now we'll start to let it zoom. We've made one output. The problems that this solution solves are getting all the salts into the right L shape, getting all the salts onto this duplication glyph without anything crashing into it. Because, I mean, we have this giant growing waste chain. We can't just rotate it arbitrarily around the solution. At least one angle, it's going to crash into this. So we have to keep everything else small enough to get in between this arm and this Van Berlo's glyph. And actually, while coming up with ideas to try to make a 50 gold mechanism solution, which I never made, I thought, what if, and this is a crazy idea, you create a very long salt chain that goes all the way through to the maximum extent of your waste chain, and you put the Van Berlo's glyph at the end, so that as this thing swings around and uses up all the space in the world, it only turns these salts into air and water at the very end. And then it uses some convoluted, like, oh, we just pass the waste and we get from one end of the waste to the other, and then you take off the output. It turns out that that's a terrible idea, and Penta Pig showed that it's easier than that by a significant factor. And I'm glad, because I would have felt bad if that was the only way to solve this in 50 gold mechanisms, something that required... This is about 5,000 cycles, but if you have to type out 100,000 cycles by hand, no one would do that, and I wouldn't want anyone to try to do that. I say this knowing what Week 8 has in store. I will record the video for that one right after I record this one, but for now, we can assume that me considering the idea of someone having to write more than 10,000 instructions for a solution is preposterous and unfair, and I wouldn't ever ask that of someone. Cough, cough. As we watch this run, this is going to become a little bit chuggier as this giant waste stalk keeps swinging around in a circle. But this solution by Penta Pig, continuing to show the dominance that he has over this game, and teach the rest of us exactly the considerations that need to be made to solve these puzzles at an extremely high level. What was also notable about this solution is that there are 2 bonders and 3 debonders. The second, both of the bonders and 2 of the debonders have no access points, but they're still useful for very specific functions. It just so happened, I think he was telling us in the Discord, that this bonder right here is the only location where you can reasonably separate these 3 metals from the half output and still be able to grab on both sides. So that was a conscious decision that debonder needed to exist in roughly that position. Meanwhile, this bonder is there to orchestrate this rather fast Quicksilver delivery. This bonder is here to help create the final bonds from the 3 air, water, air to this growing water, air, water. And I believe the other 2 debonders were the only ones that could achieve different parts of disassembling this litharge so that the salt lakes were all next to each other. So let's watch this through all the way to its final output, but for this Week 7 video, this will be the conclusion. We've seen everyone's attempts at high gloss finish, some optimized for cycles, some optimized for some, and then this one and this one alone, the achiever of the dubious cost mechanism. Congratulations to Penta Pig, and I will see you all very soon for Week 8.